Hello, everybody. I'm here to talk a little bit about our fall course. Now, this is a class that I've taught before a few times for Ollie, and many of you have taken the course, but I've got some really interesting, fun tweaks I've given to this one, and it should be fun and interesting. The course is entitled The Fab Four and the Stones: How America Surrendered to the Advance Guard of the British Invasion, Weaponized by Our Own Roots Music. Now, what often gets lost in any discussion or course about the Beatles and or the Stones is the simplest of facts, that these were two of the greatest rock and roll bands of all time. This course will take a hard look at how two groups of young British musicians infatuated with America reached deeply into arguably one of our greatest cultural legacies of the 20th century, popular music, to achieve fame and fortune. Now, in this course, we will explore how these two bands, were influenced heavily by such disparate influences as the Delta blues of the 1930s, the electric Chicago blues of the 40s and 50s, the folk and country music coming out of Nashville in the same period, the classic R&B that came out of New York and LA, and the early rock and roll that came mainly out of New Orleans, and then the rockabilly that came blazing out of Memphis in the late 50s, and the magic that was Motown, and most importantly, the poetry and guitar of Chuck Berry. For these two historic rock and roll bands, and I use that adjective in the truest sense, they took our prized legacy of popular music and they made music that changed the world. In many cases, they showed us how to play it. In '64, the Beatles and the Stones came, they saw, and they conquered. They took our music and shoved it back in our faces, showing us not only how it could be done, but making tons of money in the process. This course will examine how American roots music specifically was the launching pad for two of the greatest bands of all time, and the uncanny way in which their careers in the 1960s paralleled each other. We'll examine six phases in the history of each band, and in the spirit of learning, we'll do some contrasting and comparing. The class will look at that period when both bands were active, which was 1962 to 69, and we'll discuss why one band, the Beatles, lasted 9 years, while the other band, the Stones, has been out there doing it for 62 years. Here's our week by week class outline. Week 1, the early days, 1960 to 62. How a couple of groups of British kids found their dreams without even looking for it. London, Liverpool, and Hamburg, importing R&B and rockabilly from the States. The Beatles emulate their heroes from across the pond: Elvis, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, and the Everlys. Germany beckons as the band pays its dues and hones their chops to a razor edge, playing midnight to 5 a.m. in the Kaiser Keller in the Star Club in Germany. John Lennon said, "I grew up in Hamburg, not Liverpool." London, May '62, Brian Jones, then 20, the brilliant blues and jazz obsessed, rebellious son of amateur musicians, puts an ad in the Jazz News, and the Rolling Stones are formed. Within a few months, they're playing gigs. Week 2, Watch Out World, the heady days of '63. For the Fab Four, hey, we can write songs. As for the Rolling Stones, these guys just might be more than a great bar band. How two really tight bands parlayed their respective images into record deals. Managers Brian Epstein and Andrew Luke Oldham took a chance and turned these kids into England's and eventually America's heartthrobs. Week 3, the insanity that was '64 and Mersey Boku. The rock and roll band is a creative force. John and Paul realize that two heads are better than one. Mick and Keith start to write good songs. Brian Jones experiments, conquering America one hit at a time. The battle lines are drawn, the pretty boys versus the bad boys. George Harrison said later, on tour that year in '64 was crazy. Not within the band. In the band, we were normal. The rest of the world was crazy. Week 4, help, we need somebody because we are out of our heads. Superstardom comes to both bands. The Stones continue to honor their idols, their American idols, cutting 2 covers for every original, but finally breaking through with their artistic triumph, their first all-original record, recorded in America, while the Beatles surge into creative overdrive, deciding that they're done with gigs, thus establishing themselves as the greatest studio band of all time, with a little help from their friend Sir George Martin. A whole bunch of brilliant albums by the Fab Four, every cut a winner. Week 5, prisoners of their own success, '66 and '67. The Beatles continue to write great songs and set up shop in the studio in London, creating classic albums at a breakneck pace, but they eventually pay the price, while the Rolling Stones make a great record, followed by a psychedelic bust, and then record their classic Beggar's Banquet, signaling a return to roots rock led by the ascent of Keith Richards to the role of unquestioned leader. Week 6, the game changes, 1968 to 1969. For one group, the long farewell. For the other, the long haul. The end was not pretty for the Beatles, hastened by the schism between John and Paul. As the Fab Four broke up, the Stones, now minus Brian Jones, asserted their dominance as the world's greatest rock and roll band through a quartet of masterpiece albums and unforgettable live shows. How their respective popularity drove them to great heights and lowered them to awful depths. As a band, we were always tight, George said. We could argue a lot, but we were very, very close to each other. So that is exactly what we're going to do in this class. Many of you have taken my class. You know how I roll. We're going to have a lot of live music and guests. This is going to be live at the Freight and Salvage with all the big PA and the big screen and all the live stuff that we can muster. And I think you guys are going to love it. So I look forward to seeing everybody on October 2nd. Thanks.